Good morning, everyone, to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon, good evening to those of you elsewhere. So we've been practicing together for almost a week now, and this is the last full day of practice that we have together. So it's quite wonderful that we have this opportunity to practice together. And it's quite a rare opportunity, and so it's good that all of us, all of you, have been taking this opportunity and plugging in and actually making the most of it. And so this is a guided meditation and also a Dhamma reflection, so you're invited to meditate during this time as you listen. And Luang Pa Man would recommend that people meditate while they listen to his Dhamma talks. And he would say that the whole reason for the Dhamma talk is to gladden the mind and help to calm the mind and set the mind in a state of focus and ease. And so that if that is achieved during the talk, and if you go into that state of happiness or that state of ease, then that's the whole reason he's been giving the talk. And so that's what we want, and so that's a good thing. And one doesn't necessarily need to take notes or memorize the entire talk, every point that was said, but just to follow it with the mind, with the heart, and try to use the talk as a guide to bring the mind to a state of gladness and ease. So I would like to pick up that thread Ajahn Kurudamo was talking about, of gladdening the mind, and the phrase, the happy mind is easily concentrated. Also at the beginning of the retreat I was touching on that, and then reflecting on that more during the retreat. That the mind that is suffering, of course, it's going to be thinking of proliferating how to get out of that suffering. But then the mind that is happy and at ease, it's not going to proliferate so much about how to get out of that state, because it's already in a state that it wants to be in. But we might hear that and we might think, well, I felt happy the other day and my mind was still thinking a lot. I felt happy the other day and I was still proliferating about all sorts of things. So that is a good thing to consider and reflect on, that perhaps when we thought we were happy, that's not the real happiness that we're talking about. So when we might feel pleasant feeling, or we might feel a sense of temporary happiness, but the mind is still thinking a lot, the reason for that is because what we're experiencing is the dukkha of change. So we know that happiness is going to pass away, and so we're already proliferating. Even while we're still feeling that happiness, we're already proliferating about how we can get the next happiness when that happiness we currently have inevitably passes away. How can we get to the next happiness? And so that is kind of a catch-22. It's kind of a paradox that we keep ourselves in a state of worry and anxiety and a state of at least subtle suffering, even that taints even the current happiness that we might have. And so the happiness that is the happy mind that's easily concentrated, the word in Pali, as Ajahn Panyo brought up in his reflection, the word in Pali is api pamodayang chittang, and it's translated as gladdening the mind. I think another possible translation is delighting the mind. And can the mind be delighted with what's happening in the present? And can the mind be delighted in a way that it's not trying to already create some other future happiness when this happiness inevitably passes away? So to do that, there's all these other qualities that need to be cultivated, and Ajahn Sudhiro was touching on that. All these other qualities of patient endurance and learning, training ourselves how to not worry about the future or ruminate over the past, and how to get ourselves into a state where we're okay with whatever happens. If we're truly okay with whatever happens, then we're less likely to try to, even though we may feel happy in the moment, then we're less likely to actually think, oh, well, when this happiness passes away, I need to already set up the causes for some other future state of happiness. So that worry is kind of tainting things. So I don't think that's quite abhipamodayang chittang. The happiness where the mind would settle into concentration, I think it's more like where the Buddha's using that analogy of piti and sukha, or at least I think it's in the commentaries. Piti is like you're in a desert and you see kind of a man coming to you in the distance. His hair is wet, and he's like there's an oasis over there, and you can drink water and you can be refreshed. And the piti is like the thrill or the excitement. We would think, okay, we've been walking through the desert, and now we're gonna get to drink something. We're gonna get to be refreshed. And then you keep walking, and then that person actually reaches the oasis, and they actually dive into the water, the cool water, and drink as much as they like, and then lay down under the cool shade of a tree, fully refreshed and nourished, and that's the sukha. So when we're laying under the cool shade of a tree and fully refreshed, then the mind can start to settle, the mind can start to rest. And we've been walking through the desert, and so trying to contact that sense of refreshment in the meditation. Using the breath in order to refresh the mind. And when the hindrances are present, then the mind isn't in a state of refreshment. And so then we end up having to focus on these hindrances, having to consider them and apply antidotes if needed. So when the kamachanda, when the sense desire is present, the mind isn't refreshed. When ill will is present, the mind isn't refreshed. When sloth and torpor is present, the mind is not refreshed. It's fuzzy and unclear. When restlessness and remorse are present, the mind isn't refreshed. When doubt is present, the mind most certainly is not refreshed. But when there's mindfulness and clear awareness, sati sampajanya, then the mind is refreshed and the mind is clear. And then we can have that abhipamodayang chittang, the mind being refreshed, delighted, gladdened. Gratitude is another way to refresh the mind. So that does take some effort. Say for sloth and torpor, for example, we actually have to put some effort into straightening our spine, put some effort into raising our head up, maybe open our eyes, maybe even splash water on our face, maybe even go outside in the cold weather and do some walking. We have to use some sort of effort and perseverance to overcome these things. The interesting thing about the hindrances is these defilements of mind, these obstructive states, they're trying to convince us that going into them is what's going to make us happy. Going into them is what's going to give us that sense of refreshment. If I indulge my sense desires, then I'll feel better. If I indulge my ill will, then I'll feel better. If I give in to sloth and torpor and go and take a snooze, then I'll feel better. If I give in to my restlessness and worry if I, really act on that worry, really, go deeper into it, then I'll solve the problem somehow. If I really go into my doubt and really chew it over and really look at it more closely, then maybe I'll solve it. Maybe then I'll feel better. So the 5 hindrances are always writing treatises in this way. They're always writing teachings for us. They're always writing suttas. They're writing suttas for us to follow, but they're the false suttas. So we have to follow the suttas of the Buddha, where we make the mind clear and refreshed through using sati sampajanya to let go of those 5 hindrances. And they'll still come back to nag us. That's why it's a struggle. That's why it's a struggle to practice. So it's no wonder that it's difficult for us to come to that state of abhipamodayang chittang, where actually the mind is able to start to settle. Because if the mind is truly gladdened, truly delighted, and truly resting in the cool shade of the tree of mindfulness and clear awareness, you could almost make a case that that type of happiness is samadhi, or at least the dividing line between that happiness and samadhi is very blurred, and it could just drop right in. So let us focus on that type of happiness. We don't need to think about samadhi. This is a natural progression of things. There's one sutta where the Buddha talks about the natural progression toward liberation. And I believe it's in the Nidana Samyutta, the Samyutta Nikaya, the part on causation, and it's one of my favorite suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya. It's the proximate cause sutta, where the Buddha goes through dependent origination, ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, name and form, and so on, up to suffering, ignorance eventually being cause for craving and suffering, birth, aging, sickness and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. But then suffering acts as a cause for faith. And then faith ends up, there's a whole another set of causes and conditions that the Buddha goes into the positive direction. Suffering ends up being a cause for faith, or a search for the way out of suffering. And faith acts as a cause for, and my apologies if I missed some steps here, I haven't read this sutta in a while, and certainly haven't reviewed it before this talk, but faith acts as a cause for seeking out teachers, seeking out kalyanamitta, seeking out good spiritual friendship. Seeking out good spiritual friendship acts as a cause for hearing the true Dhamma. And hearing the true Dhamma acts as a cause for the keeping of the precepts, and the keeping of the precepts acts as a cause for non-remorse. Naturally, keeping the precepts naturally leads on to non-remorse. Non-remorse naturally leads on to the relinquishing of the hindrances. Relinquishing of the hindrances leads naturally on to happiness. Happiness leads naturally on to samadhi, to a firm stability of mind, of heart. That leads naturally on to knowledge and vision of things as they are. Knowledge and vision of things as they are leads naturally on to disenchantment. And disenchantment leads naturally on to liberation. Liberation leads naturally on to knowledge and vision of liberation. So it's this natural progression, kind of starting with suffering, actually. starting with suffering, but then leading on to confidence that there's a way out, hearing the true Dhamma, and so on. So we come back to the precepts, we come back to these foundational things, these foundational practices. And the Buddha's giving these teachings that this is the causes we have to put in place for that. Abhipamodayang chittang, all those causes and conditions have to be in place. The keeping of the precepts. Seeing danger in the slightest fault. Not in a neurotic or self-defeating way, but in the way of confidence that this is how the mind becomes happy. And then that confidence in the mind that becomes happy, this is how the mind actually attains some sort of stability and firmness. I prefer to the word concentration, which is normally how samadhi is translated. I like the Thai. The Thai is Tang Jai Man, which is the firm establishing, the upright, you could almost say the upright establishing of the heart. Tang Jai Man. It's almost like, the image I'm getting is almost like, rather than laying down and being defeated, it's like standing up and opening our eyes. And that samadhi is where we stand up. And yet still it's a struggle. All of this is a struggle. Because we're having to call into question our habits of mind that have been there for a long time. And our past habits of mind, our addictions, have given us little hits of pleasure here and there. Very fleeting, very impermanent. But it's enough to cause the mind to be addicted to them. Because we don't yet know anything else. We don't yet know any higher happiness. That's why we have to have good examples. That's why we have to have Kalyana Mitta. That's why we have to listen to the teachings over and over and over. That's why we have to take the precepts over and over. That's why we have to practice the meditation again and again and recite all these teachings, reflect on them. We have to do this over and over again. And then it starts to sink in. We may have been able to contact that a little bit just practicing together for a week. Bringing our practice to a state of balance. This is going to help the mind to have that sense of delight. So not only have we been meditating and the knees might be hurting, the back might be hurting, but then we've been trying to balance that with the Qigong practice, trying to bring up some energy in another way. If things get a bit stale or stagnant or the mind feels tense or tight, it's good to just have those break periods. Sometimes if the meditation's very pleasant and going well, we might feel like we want to meditate through the break periods, and many of you have been doing that. But also if the mind becomes tense and tight and is shaking and quivering a little bit too much, we might want to stop meditating during the break periods and just go outside, look at the sky, go for a walk. Just let go of the meditation for a bit. That can give us insight. It's similar to Luang Por Chah saying that in the first year of his meditation practice, it was just suffering the whole time. His mind was just agitated, and he was trying so hard. And he was thinking, he's trying so hard. Why is it? Why am I not getting the results? And then he said after a year, he had this experience of just giving up. It's very similar to what Ajahn Sadhiro was talking about. So Luang Por Chah had this experience of just giving up. And then suddenly his mind was peaceful. And he started to notice that when he was meditating, his mind wasn't peaceful. And when he wasn't meditating, his mind was peaceful. So he thought, well, the practice is supposed to make us peaceful, so maybe there's something I need to be looking at here. When I'm not meditating, my mind is peaceful, and when I am meditating, my mind's agitated. So he saw that there was all these expectations he was bringing to the meditation. All these expectations and trying so hard, and thereby putting in all these mental factors in the meditation that was causing the mind to be stirred up and agitated. And then at that point of just giving up and letting things be, the mind was peaceful. So why? That's interesting. Why is that? So that's how we start to develop skill in meditation. And we're still going to make mistakes. That's to be expected. So often we might feel, I want to get it right. I want to do it right. Just give me the instruction. I'll do exactly what you say. And yet we can hear all the instructions and still not get it right because we have to see for ourselves. We have to learn for ourselves. I like to give the analogy sometimes of sharpening knives, sharpening chisels, and you have these different sharpening stones, and you can watch YouTube videos, you can learn about, from all the books, how to sharpen. You can read all sorts of books about sharpening, watch all sorts of YouTube videos, try to copy their motions, but still, those knives, those chisels aren't going to be sharp until we put a lot of practice and go through the whole frustration of learning how to sharpen, observing, how does this actually work? So this is where the 4 Iddhipadas come in. We want to make it work. We want to learn how to practice. And it's not that we just let go of all desire right at the outset. We have to want to practice. We have to want to do it. We have to want to learn how to sharpen. So then we put effort into it. These are the first 2 Iddhipadas. This is Chanda and Virya. Chanda is a little bit different than Tanha. My own reflection on Chanda is that Chanda, it can be wholesome or unwholesome. For example, the first hindrance is Kama Chanda. And then in the Four Noble Truths, we have Kama Tanha. So those are both translated as sensual desire. But I would translate Kama Chanda. If you look at Kama Tanha, I would say that's sensual desire. But then Kama Chanda, I think of more as like sensual drive. Like Chanda has more of like a moving into energy. I'm going to do this. I'm going to get this. Whereas Tanha has more of like a drunken or bewildered energy to it, and we're just kind of like lost in craving. So we have to have Chanda, we have to have a certain drive, even a certain passion. We're not supposed to cultivate passion in general. We want viraga, we want dispassion. But there is also this term, this very interesting term I've reflected on a lot. It's Dhamma raga. It's actually like passion for the Dhamma. So we do have to have that certain drive for this. And virya, the energy, persistence. So in learning how to sharpen knives. And we have a different sharpening stones, the coarsest to the finest, depending on how sharp we want to get the knife. And then we work at it, and the knife isn't any sharper. Perhaps we even made it duller than before. We think, well, this practice of sharpening isn't working. the knife is duller than before. This practice of meditation isn't working. My mind has more hindrances than before. So we stop, we give up. But if we stop at that point, we're certainly never going to learn how to do it. So we have to keep practicing. And so we persevere, and we look closely at the edge of the knife, and we look, what am I doing wrong? Is the angle wrong? Is my technique wrong? And we start to develop muscle memory in the motion of how to bring the blade back and forth on the sharpening stone. And then we eventually, if we practice long enough, we have an experience, that first experience of the knife actually being sharp. Oh, wow, it actually got sharp. Okay, now I can move up to the next sharpening stone. And then we find we have to work a really long time again. There might be that impulse to go to the very highest sharpening stone at first. So we have a dull knife, and, well, I'm going to go straight to the 16,000 grit stone. And we want to skip to the end. I want to go straight to insight. I want to skip to the end. I want to go straight to Nibbana. But if we don't put in all the causes beforehand, that 16,000 grit stone's not going to do anything to that knife. It's not going to make it sharp. It's not going to make it 16,000 grit sharp. We have to go up through every single stone. And not only that, but on every single stone, we have to go longer and longer. So the path is really like that. We can't just skip over to the end. Or we might have Kama with Chan or Zen practice, and we might think, well, they talk about sudden enlightenment. Can you skip to the end? Can you have sudden enlightenment? Can it just suddenly happen to you? When Master Shu Yun was asked this question, he said, well, is it gradual or is it sudden? And he said, his answer was, over a very long period of time, you gradually practice, then it suddenly happens. So that's how he answered, and he was supposed to be one of the greatest Chan masters in the past couple centuries. So we really can't, that idea of taking shortcuts is going to be a hindrance for us. There's that example that I know Longpo Pasano has given many times of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. There was a teaching that some Sangha members here were able to attend, and a large group of people. This was probably 20 years ago. And then there was a Q&A session, and people in the audience were able to ask questions, and one person asked, what's the quickest way to enlightenment? What's the swift path? What's the shortcut? And His Holiness the Dalai Lama kind of started to answer a little bit, and then he burst into tears and started crying, sobbing. And maybe a few thousand people in the audience, and dead silent. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama kind of gathered himself, and he just said, you can't think like that you'll never get anywhere. You can't think like that. That's completely antithetical to the practice, to think like that, because we need patience. This is me talking now, not the Dalai Lama. We need patience as vast as the ocean. We need very, very deep and vast patience, perseverance. Sometimes we can even just tell ourselves those words while we're meditating, trying to cultivate that abhipamodayang chittang, deep, vast, measureless. This kind of harkens back to the question of, who is practicing if there's no, if everything is not self. Who is practicing? Another one of my favorite suttas is where somebody comes to the Buddha and says, you talk about your seeing all your past lives on the night of your awakening, and you talk about how the five khandhas are not self. And you talk about rebirth, but then there's nobody to be reborn. And this is perplexing to me. And the Buddha says, well, yes, you are perplexed about a perplexing matter. And so his questioner, the Buddha's questioner says, so where is an Arhat reborn? Where is a Buddha reborn? Where is a liberated being reborn? And the Buddha's saying, well, that's not a valid question. Well, do they exist after death? Not a valid question. Do they not exist after death? Not a valid question. Do they both exist and not exist after death? Buddha says, not a valid question. Do they neither exist nor not exist after death? Not a valid question. And so his questioner is like, well, that doesn't make sense. And the Buddha says, well, I have to reframe it for you, ask you a question in return, because I'll ask you a series of questions in return, because the whole premise is incorrect. All of those questions assume atta, they assume, they don't take into account the truth of non-self. All those questions assume it must be something. It must be some sort of state. It must be something. So that's the whole way we think. That's the whole habitual way of thinking that keeps us in samsara. And so the Buddha says, well, when, say you have a candle and you blow out the flame, does the flame go to the north? And his questioner says, not a valid question. Does the flame go to the east? Not a valid question. Does the flame go to the south? Not a valid question. Does the flame go to the west? Not a valid question. And so then the Buddha says, well, so where did the flame go? And this person says, well, the flame is termed simply as out. It didn't go anywhere. It's just termed as out. And so the Buddha then says, just so the mind of an arhat after death is simply termed as out of craving, out of samsara, out of that which it can be reckoned by. And the mind of the Tathagata is vast and deep, like the great ocean. So he describes it using these words: vast, deep, immeasurable. And so this is something that the Buddha and the great meditation masters of the past, they assure us that it can be realized or experienced directly. But what can we actually say about it? We always want to skip to the end. We want to start with the 16,000 grit stone. We've got to just work our way up, one stone at a time. It's the only way. But if we do it, if we persevere, then it can be done. It can be done. That's the promise. So the third of the Iddhipadas is citta. I like to think of that as applying the mind. Citta, putting your heart into it, paying attention, focusing on what we're doing, not getting distracted from what we're doing. And then the fourth Iddhipada is vimamsa, or reviewing. Did it work? What worked? What didn't work? Looking at the edge of that blade and seeing, where did it get sharp? Where didn't it get sharp? What was the result of what I just did? So that can almost be like a mantra for us. Chanda, virya, citta, vimamsa. And then once we review, how did it go? We go back and we still have to have that drive. Let's keep going. Let's not stop here. Let's keep moving forward. Let's put the effort in. Let's put the time in. Let's really do this. Let's really learn this. And again, it's a struggle. Keeping the precepts is a struggle at first, until we see the benefit of them. And then it's a delight. It's a delight to keep the precepts. Meditation is a struggle at first, but then it can be delightful later on, when the mind starts to settle a bit. Trying to cultivate discernment is a struggle at first, but later on, it's the very thing that is going to liberate us and free us from the confines of our own